probably the most people we've had that weren't directly hired by the town for a budget meeting that I've seen in 20 years. So either you all have a very huge interest in this or you have nothing better to do. Play it with either way. But this is the bailiwick of the clerk treasurer, so we're going to turn the meeting over to her, and Mark will run with it, or Jenny will run with it. And it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Susan with Baker Tilly is going to come up and present the 2020 budget. We'll just go through. Feel free to jump in with any questions at any point that you have. I provided you with our accounting reports last week and the salary wages with 1%, 2%, and 3% raises for 2020. Ready.
Good evening, Council. I am Susan Cowan with Baker Tilly. Paige Sansone is also with me. I believe you've seen her for presentations in the past. So get your questions all answered and get everything tied up for you. The document that Jenny passed out to you earlier. What's that?
If you're old enough, you remember Max Headroom. That was it.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
I swear it's never happened before.
Of course.
That was cool. Do it again.
I don't know if I can. We'll see. The document that Jenny passed out to you is the summary that we've prepared of the budget. It has 4 sections, 3 sections that are the sections and the funds that have salaries and wages, and it shows a 1% option raise, a 2%, and a 3%. The final section are those funds that don't have salaries and wages, but I wanted to go over your budget numbers with you for those funds as well. Starting into the document, the first page there, the third page actually, has some of the assumptions that we've used in putting together your numbers. The town provided us with budget numbers. So we then estimated receipts for you. The DLGF levy growth factor this year is 3.5%. Last year it was 3.4%. We've used the numbers that are next in number 2 are what we've used for net assessed value. We're not able to get to the current net assessed value for the county, so we've duplicated 2019's for this year. So we're using the same one. We then estimated your circuit breaker effect for next year based upon historical circuit breakers, and on your general Parks and Rec and CD funds, or CUME capital development, it's about 10.2%, and then on your debt service funds, it's only 0.1%. For number 4, we estimated your CVET excise and fit for those funds that receive property tax levy. It's roughly 8.5% of the levy. For local income taxes, we used the numbers available from the DLGF. 2018 and 2019 numbers are certified, and the 2020 numbers are currently an estimate. Number 6, we looked then at other distributed receipts from the state. Some of those were flatlined. Most of them are just at a 0% growth. We then looked at miscellaneous receipts and evaluated historical receipts and came up with our numbers then for the estimates for 2020. For disbursements, we simply used your budget numbers. So that's pretty easy. You use your actual for 2018 and then what your 2019 budget and your 2020 budget numbers are right now. The first page 4 is the general fund. All of the pages are going to follow the same basic layout, so I'll just give you a quick summary of what you're seeing on each page. So we have your 2018 actual. That's what actually happened. We then go to 2019. That's your budget as it stands. We are assuming that you would spend everything that was budgeted last year. You may not. It's possible that you won't. So your numbers may actually look and up at the end of this year better than what we're showing on paper here tonight. And then 2020 obviously is what we anticipate for your budget next year. So this is the general fund with a 1% raise in the salaries and wages. So you can look, the first section you want to see is your operating receipts. Those are the things you normally bring in on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis. In 2018, you brought in $5.7 million. And then your operating disbursements are the next section down. In 2018, you spent roughly $5.4 million in operating expenses. You then maybe have some one-off type of receipts that we list down below in other receipts, and you may see other disbursements as well. The line you want to pay attention to, there says increase, and then it has decrease in parentheses, and cash equivalents. That gives you an idea of whether you are adding to your cash reserves in the fund or you are depleting your cash reserves in the fund. If it's a positive number, like it was in 2018, you added $390,000 to your general fund. We are anticipating for 2019, you're spending a very small amount, about $332. But again, that's only if you spend everything you have budgeted currently, or if you bring in the exact same numbers here. Those can obviously change. And then 2020, we're looking at you spending possibly about $20,000 into your reserves with the 1% salary and raise scenario. Then we have an operating balance line. That shows a comparison or the relative amount of operating disbursements to your ending balance. So we'd like to have that number stay at 25% or above, which in this case, you're at 32% at the end of last year, and with the 1% raise, you were over 28%. Are there any questions about your general fund?
And the higher that percent is,
the better.
the better we look when we go out for bonding.
For debt, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Because since one of your main sources of revenue here is your tax levy, you get those twice a year. If you don't have anything to operate with in between getting those tax draws, that can be difficult to pay salaries and utilities and everything else. So you like to have some in reserve so you can make those payments as necessary until your tax draws come through.
Just a quick question. Where are a lot of other municipalities? Are we on the high end with, 27, 28% reserve, or that kind of medium, or are a lot of communities?
A lot of communities struggle to hit the 25%. They do the best they can. We recommend 15 as an absolute bare minimum. Don't try to let yourselves go below
sorry,
that.
You said 25?
15.
I'm sorry, you said 25.
25 in your case. For the town of Danville, yes, 25. Do not go below 25. Definitely do not go below 25 in Danville. So we see very few towns that have, in their general fund especially, 45 or 50% operating balances. So, yeah, you are probably right there in a good spot.
Okay.
The next fund we look at is the Economic Development Fund. You do pay some salaries and wages here. That's why it's in this section. You receive the Economic Development Lit for this fund. You see in 2018, you added $104,000 to your bottom line. In 2019, we expect you to add $63,000. And with the 1% budget scenario, you would add roughly $43,000. And you're well over that 25% operating balance here. In the non-levy funds, it's somewhat easier to do. It depends on what you're using it for. This is more of a project-based fund. You do happen to have salaries and wages, but for the most part, it's a project-based fund.
Yeah, the one patrolman is paid out of the edit fund. And then this is what we also use for the redevelopment commission and what we're doing at looking for the TIF area and those things. $100,000 of here is allocated for that.
The next one is your Parks and Recreation Fund. Now, there are salaries and wages here, but these are part-time and seasonal salary and wage. So these were not affected by any raise increase. These you will basically see the same thing going through on the park fund because there weren't raises applied to those salaries and wages. So in this case, you've just started this fund back up last year, I believe. So this will be 2020 will be your third year receiving property tax for the Parks and Rec. So you're trying to get this fund built up a little bit. You're not quite at the 25%. You're around that 15% operating balance for this fund. But again, you're just trying to work back into this one and get some revenues built up, some park receipts, some pool receipts coming in to get yourself some additional here. So that's why you're only paying the seasonal and part-time people from this fund at current. So you did add roughly $32,000 to the fund in 2018. At the end, you brought in more than you spent. Then in 2019, about maybe $1,000, and then you're spending a little bit into it there in 2020. But again, that's dependent upon the whole budget being spent in 19 and 20. The next one is your motor vehicle highway fund, your gas tax money. This year, you've had to split this money into two separate pots, one that is restricted for construction, reconstruction, and preservation of roads, and the other one that can be used to pay regular salaries and wages, snow plowing, street signs, different functions for the money. In this one, we actually, for your receipts, you do not see it flatlined because we recently received information from the state that they expect the 2020 receipts to be approximately 8% lower than your 2019 receipts due to some miscalculation that went on with the city of Indianapolis and Marion County. So this one, it affects your MVH and your cigarette tax. So the cigarette tax in the general fund dropped a little bit, and you'll see as we get to it, your CCI cigarette tax dropped a little bit there too. But in this one, you did add about $276,000 last year to the coffers. And then in 2019, we're expecting you to spend in by about $100,000, and then again by about $94,000 based upon the budget numbers that were turned in 2020. Next, we have your park non-reverting fund. This is where your park impact fee money comes in, as well as other charges for services and fees. And there are some salaries and wages that are paid from this fund as well. In 2018, you added about $129,000 to the bottom line here for the park impact non-reverting. And then in 2019, you added roughly $42,000, and then we expect about $30,000 going into that fund again in 2020 with the budget numbers we were given. And this you can use for projects in support of the park. The next page 9 is wastewater treatment. This one is not a fund that has a budget that goes on Gateway for DLGF review, but we have historically prepared a glimpse for you of your utility funds so you can see your general fund and the replacement funds that go along with water and wastewater. For the wastewater fund, in 2018, you added roughly $113,000 to the bottom line. Then in 2019, you added almost $61,000. In 2020, we expect you to add about $28,000. Some of these numbers, if department heads look at these and say something looks too high or something looks too low, you can get me new numbers. Let us know. We can regenerate this if you'd like. Last year, I think we found that something wasn't being paid the way it was supposed to, and so we were able to get that taken care of by having department heads look at these when we pass them out. So the next one is the water fund. Here, you added about $191,000 last year. And then in 2019, we are showing you spending into reserves by about $377,000, and then again by roughly $416,000 in 2020. So that's just decreasing that balance. I mean, it's a utility fund, but you do have to pay your water staff out of this fund. So you don't want to, you're drifting down, granted, from 154% to 65%. So you still have a strong balance, but just be aware that for 2 years in a row, it looks like you'll be spending into the reserves here. The next one is the stormwater fund. In this case, last year you used about $48,000 of your reserves. In 2019, it looks like you'll be adding back roughly $37,000, and then in 20, about $47,000 back to the bottom line. So you are adding some money to your utilities there. The next section looks very much like the section we just saw. In fact, the first two columns on each page are the same. The only one that's different is the 2020 column. The 2020 column takes into account a 2% wage and salary increase. So you may have to rip this apart and place them side by side to make it make sense to you. But like in this case, for the general fund, for the 1%, you were spending into reserves by roughly $20,000. In this case, with the 2%, you're spending into reserves by roughly $47,000. In most cases, all other things stayed equal. It was just insurance, perf, and wages that changed. Social Security, Medicare, those payments on wages went up too. So,
does the fact that we have pays next year have an impact on that as well?
2020 is 1% 1%. 2020 is 2%. 2021 is 2%. 2022 is 2%. 2023 is 2%. 2024 is 2%. 2025 is 2%. 2026 is 2%. 2027 is 2%. 2028 is 2%. 2029 is 2%. 2030 is 2%. 2031 is 2%. 2032 is 2%. 2033 is 2%. 2034 is 2%. 2035 is 2%. 2036 is 2%. 2037 is 2%. 2038 is 2%. 2039 is 2%. 2040 is 2%. 2041 is 2%. 2042 is 2%. 2043 is 2%. 2044 is 2%. 2045 is 2%. 2046 is 2%. 2047 is 2%. 2048 is 2%. 2049 is 2%. 2050 is 2%. 2051 is 2%. 2052 is 2%. 2053 is 2%. 2054 is 2%. 2055 is 2%. 2056 is 2%. 2057 is 2%. 2058 pays were calculated on all of these numbers. So yes, the 27 pays, and it does make it go up, yes. Yep, it sure does. And then on the economic development, still quite healthy there, even with the 2%. You just pay the one salary out of this one, so it's not quite as big of a impact. And then Parks and Recreation, like I said, it's the same as the other one because this one didn't have a raise applied to any of those wages and salary. Motor Vehicle Highway is next, whereas in the 1% scenario, you were going to spend into your reserves by about 94,243. Here you're spending in by 94,613. So again, you can see it's a small impact here in the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund too, when it comes to the salary and wage change. Then your park non-reverting. Currently, next year we'd expect you to spend in by about $29,000. The previous example was, it's $30,000, so something, but yeah, something else I believe changed in that one too. So, then we go on to wastewater, and again, wastewater has healthy balances, and water, you are spending again, about $420,000 next year of your balances of your reserves. And then stormwater, we're expecting you to add $46,000 with a 2% raise to any of those employees covered under stormwater. And the last section we have of the salary and wage funds, this is what we have prepared to post on Gateway. Because with Gateway, you can always post higher and adopt lower. You can't go the opposite direction, especially on a fund like your general fund. So that's where we've put some room in there in case other things come up even. So you would have some elbow room there in case you do need to add something at the last minute or make some changes. So this is what will be posted on Gateway when the budget is posted. And so you can see here, I believe, last time I told you it was about $47,000. In this case, it's $74,000 with the 3% salary and wage that you would be spending from your reserves. In economic development, you still, with 3%, you still end up with 135% operating balance at the end of next year. For parks and recreation, you would end up with about a $30,000 balance at the end, about a 14% operating balance. Motor vehicle highway, you still have an 88% operating balance with the 3%. Again, as I noted, it doesn't make a lot of difference between the 1%, 2%, and 3% in motor vehicle highway. And then your park non-reverting, you still have over $356,000 anticipated at the end of next year there with current numbers. The wastewater treatment, balance of $774,000 at the end of next year. Water fund, $1.2 million still at the end of next year. Of course, like you said, you're still spending about almost $430,000 next year into your reserves based upon current numbers. And then your stormwater fund, you end up with a balance of roughly $581,000, 176% operating balance. So stormwater's, as it shows, is whether it's 1%, 2%, or 3%, you're still healthy in your stormwater fund. The last section we have here are those funds that don't have any salaries and wages in them. So there's just one section with this smattering of funds. The first one is the CCI building fund. This is the one that I said your receipts are expected to drop for 2020, about 8% less than 2018. So you can see in 2019. So you see 2019, we're expecting you to get roughly $18,000. Next year, it's like $16,900. But for the time being, those receipts are expected to drop. And this is, again, a project-based fund. I assume you have something specific you use this one for, Jenny?
Yes.
That's what I thought. Balance of about $11,000, almost $12,000 at the end of next year with current budget numbers. The next one is your cumulative capital development fund. This is a fund that does receive tax levy. Again, pretty much a project fund. You see the budget is other services and charges for the large part. But does look like you will have at the end of next year a $410,000 balance and a 207% operating balance. So you have things available here. If need be, you could maybe do some projects or purchase some things from this fund if you needed to shift it from general or someplace else. The next page is your wagering fund or the riverboat fund. Some people call it, it's the casino riverboat distribution that comes out once a year. We generally just flatline that amount because you get pretty much the same amount each year. And you'll have about $88,000 there. Again, this can be used for special projects or special items. And then the local road and street fund, another one that comes from the gas tax money. And you have expected at the end of next year a balance of almost $223,000. So you would have some leeway here, maybe for a project or supplies that would not necessarily be able to be purchased from motor vehicle highway, possibly, if that came up. So you would have some leeway here. You can't pay salaries and wages from this one, but you can buy supplies, other services and charges, vehicles, things like that, equipment. We have a budget in here for your law enforcement and continuing education fund. It's a fairly small fund, but it shows, I believe, gun permit money comes in here, and we see that you'll have about almost a $13,000 balance at the end of next year based upon current budget numbers. And then your rainy day fund is next. You don't have anything budgeted out of here or any sort of expenditure. It's just showing you basically that you're getting interest in here each year, and this fund is growing by that amount each year, and you're now at about $893,000 for the end of next year. Then we have the next two funds are your bond funds. You have property tax attached to your park bonds, and then under the Go Bonds fund, there is a police vehicle bond from 2017 and a public works bond, which I believe is from 2014. So those two funds currently support that debt. So the 2017 one is going to be done at the end of next year. So I think Jenny has mentioned you might want to pick up another bond for more vehicle purchases, but that's to be decided in the future. For right now, that doesn't consider any of that. This just looks at those bonds dropping off at the end of next year. Then the next two funds are the replacement funds for wastewater and water. Generally, in utility operations, each month they'll make what they call depreciation transfers to build a fund like this for replacements. So you come to an agreed upon amount. Each month you agree that amount goes in there, and it builds to buy special projects, fund special projects or equipment. And so you can see that you've got about $160,000 at the end of next year in the wastewater fund, and then about $377,000 in the water fund, water replacement fund at the end of the next year. So those transfers.
That number is actually higher. We've had problems with our accounting software and doing the transfers, so it's a couple months in the lag. It'll get caught up in October, so that number is actually higher.
Okay. And the last fund here is your host community agreement fund. The one thing I want to point out here is actually line 23, where you see what your ending cash and cash equivalents are in this fund. If you look at the end of 2018, it was $1.165 million at the end of last year. 2019, if you spend everything that's coming in budget-wise, you're going to spend down to about $750,000 for balance. And then for 2020, based upon this budget, you're going to spend about another $601,000, leaving roughly $149,000. If you look at your historical receipts, you get roughly $700,000 plus some interest into this fund. You would want to really look at trying to keep your disbursements, your budgeted items, as close as you can to that $700,000. So you can see for 2020, the budgeted number is $1.3 million. So you're $600,000-ish over that $700,000. So that's why that balance is dropping each year as you spend into that fund. So it's just something I wanted to point out, and so that you've taken note of it and see that that's what's happening. And again, that's only if you spend your whole budget this year and your whole budget next year. Depending on what you actually do, it could look different. One other fund I wanted to mention that's actually not here is we did create a budget in this year's 2020 budget for your new food and beverage tax. We put about $225 in there in other services and charges.
225,000.
So it's, what did I say?
Dollars.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. You got to cut way back. Yes, sorry about that. Yes, 225,000 based upon anticipated receipts.
Wow.
Of course, and like Jenny said, if that doesn't actually happen to be what you receive from the fund, the spending can be adjusted accordingly. But she wanted to get some appropriations in there so that when the money does start coming in, you would have the ability to spend without having to do additionals or anything of that sort. So are there any other questions we could answer for you?
On the 1, 2, and 3. I mean, you crunch the numbers all the time.
Right.
You can see the trends better than we can.
Right.
I'm just interested.
I mean, the thing we always say with, when you decide to do 3% raises, it's not just this year. That you're creating then a bigger number for next year and a bigger number for the following year and a bigger number there. So, I mean, that's just what you need to consider if you feel you need to do this. Your balance is still, if you are trying to keep above that 25%, you may have to cut some expenditures someplace else next year or the following year to keep supporting a 3% raise each year. Obviously, a 1% is going to be a little bit easier to take from year to year, but doing repeated 3% raises eventually just makes that base number higher and higher. Yes, exactly. It does. So, I mean, it's obviously the call of the council and what you choose to do for your community and your employees, but it's just so you know in the back of your head, every time we give a raise, it's not this year, it's next year, and then if we do another one, it adds there, and so it just keeps growing. And, taxes, your levy amount only grows by a fixed amount each year. This year's 3.5%. Next year, they're estimating 4%, but that could easily change. And they keep chipping away at things like gas tax. So it's a balancing act. You have a certain pot to work with and to decide what is the most important things for you to accomplish with that money. So that just has to be part of your decision-making process. That I can't tell you whether you should do 1, 2, or 3, but it's just the things that you need to look at when you're doing that. Are there other things you're expecting? Are you expecting having to add employees for any reason? Of course, that's going to make it larger even still. So that's just consideration.
Sure. I mean, just to put this in perspective, with a 3% raise, and I'm on yes, you can afford it. Yes, your cash balance is good. But just pay particular attention to the cash that you would be using if you entire budget. So let's put it this way. For the 3% raise in your general fund, $25,000. Is there something that you can do without? Maybe at some point in the future, your cash reserve, and we don't want that. So, do you have perfectly balanced budgets? No, but they're pretty close. So I think that's what I would caution you on. If, whether it be, I'm sure it was 1, 2, or 3%, they all had the negative cash flow, meaning you're going to use some cash flow. It's not to a large extent. I think it's something that you could potentially make a budget adjustment if you, or maybe that's what you could you make it $75,000? Something that you need to. Susan said something earlier about matching your budget with your receipts. Say that so that you won't utilize cash reserves. Sometimes we utilize cash reserves just for the normal day-to-day recurring benefits. You can't every year use cash. Eventually run out. Susan, we can't really make it. We can give you an overview of what we see here.
So next year will be 600,000 over budget?
Are you talking specific about the general fund?
Yeah, the last part you commented last
Okay.
page.
Look at it.
Oh, for the host community?
Oh.
I mean, right now, based on what's budgeted, you will utilize 600. A pretty big chunk of really things that.
And
Sure, but that's.
$202,000 of that is money that you're transferring to those bond funds that I mentioned in order to control that rate to support the bonds. You're doing some transfers from here, one to each bond, to cover that. So part of that you've kind of got dedicated to a purpose that you may not be able, that 1.1 million there at the top, that's where you could make some changes or some cuts or some, make some decisions there with that money. The 200,000, you're probably sort of, until those park bonds anyway, and the public works bonds are paid off. It's either that or that rate would be increased.
Thank you. What do you guys charge for this? Is that a fair question? What's the cost for this?
So we just.
Sure. So it is a fair question. We charge time and expense. So honestly, I don't know where we're at on this. I can say in past years it was anywhere between maybe 12 and 15,000 to do the whole budget from start to finish and do these cash flow analysis. I just don't know where we're at right now, but we don't charge a flat fee. It's just time and expense. Whatever we have into it, that's what we will bill.
And you bird dog us all year, or do you just come in at the end of the year and do this and go home?
No, we assist all year. If Ginny needs anything out of her office, we are there for assistance. She generally, because she's good clerk treasurer, doesn't need our help until budget season. But yeah, anything. Yeah, we do annual report help, and there's some other annual reports. Yep.
What questions do you guys have?
Well, thank you very much. This is a lot of information to kind of digest all at once. A few things stand out. Obviously, stay above 25. Looking at our accounts, aside from the general, and there's another if it dealt with part 16-ish. It seems like all of them are up substantially. Could it be that just not as efficient as we need to be when it's as far as taking out and then say like post? I'm looking at an account that maybe has a balance of 154%. What we're looking at, and then looking at this one with a 3%, maybe going down to 11%. And it's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, but could we be kind of getting more creative like that? Does that help, or in the big scheme of things, it is what it is? I'm not an accountant.
No, it's okay. I think the town already does a pretty good job of trying to utilize the reserves where they can. The problem is that some of these funds that have higher cash reserves can only be used for very specific purposes. So that limits what we can do, and we can't permanently transfer from one fund to another, unfortunately. So sometimes, well, a lot of times, cities and towns will have these big buckets of money, and they just don't have the use for it right away because they can't be used for every municipal purpose. So we have those restrictions just because you're a governmental entity. But I think the town does a pretty good job of looking at where there's fund balances and trying to use those where they can. Yeah, and we also can shift property tax. Like you've got your park fund, your general fund, and motor vehicle highway. They can all utilize property tax. Well, if one fund starts to build up cash reserves, we'll recommend that we shift some property tax. But we can only do that during budget time. So right now, as you see it in the cash flows, we've allocated property tax appropriately, so not any one fund is getting too much or too less. So that's a way to kind of even it out a little bit.
Because that's what we run into with the funds, is what specifically we can use them for, and that's
kind of always been the fight.
right.
public to understand that, exactly the way you described it. There's buckets of money, but we can only dip into that bucket for a specific reason. You see a pool of money that's high, let's say it's $1 million, and sorry, you can't touch that $1 million to go into salaries, which is usually where we're looking to spend money. Hey, thank you. That makes a complicated process and project just a wee bit less complicated. Any other questions? Where do we go from here?
Well, I need you guys to make a recommendation on the raises, because the next meeting's our public hearing, and then the next meeting is our adoption. So we just need the figures to enter in the gateway and to advertise.
Well, got the 1%, 2%, 3%. And there it's roughly $75,000 percent. Is that a good way of looking at it? For general? Okay. Okay. All right. Has there been any recommendations by the staff to increase employees in any departments?
The only thing that we've looked at would be the name what we're looking for, code enforcement person.
Mm-hmm.
Would take the place of the parking enforcement person, but also be much more versatile. We would be looking at someone who takes care of grass cutting complaints, trash complaints, unkept properties. They'd also work with, consider it's, a code compliance thing when we look at footer inspections and roof permits, and they'd really be a jack of all trades, and probably even get into some line locates so that we can spread the wealth a little bit of funding it as well, so that not everything's coming from the general fund. 30-30, 30-10 split. Nobody would be hit too hard. We think that the person could be utilized for pretty close to everything, exception of maybe parks. We'll figure something out. But we do believe that there's, as the community grows, we get more and more complaints, more and more code. That's the only position. Is there anybody else looking for it?
No, not at this time. And that salary is built into this budget.
Well, just looking at it offhand, speaking honestly and as succinctly as I can, I do want to make sure that we give our employees a raise. I think 1% is easy to do, but I would encourage at least a 2. Our people work hard. We need to reward them. We need to be prudent so that we can continue to pay the bills. I would have no problem with the 2%, possibly, 75,000, if you will, maybe looking towards a new employee somewhere, depending on what the need is. Talk to several department heads, and they all have needs. You balance one over the other. 3%, that's just 3%. I'm okay with most of it, but boy, I'm just afraid, as the ladies pointed out, it's 3%, 3%, 3%. And as Tom said, it gets compounded and starts going exponential. And I know that's been a fear of yours as well, that we can't, unless we have other funding sources that kind of magically appear.
It's sustaining it over the years.
It's going to be tough. So I would say a 2% kind of splits the difference. Helps out our employees, and at the same time saves a few dollars. But that's just my humble opinion.
What did we do last year?
2%.
What do you see as a trend around our state?
So the question is, what do we see as a trend around the state? It varies all over the state, and I got to tell you, though, the municipalities that are impacted the most by circuit breaker, in other words, they're losing a lot of property tax because of the circuit breaker, they're not giving any raises. So it just varies. I see 1, 2, 3, on up to 5%. That's rare. So you guys are not too heavily impacted by circuit breaker. As Susan mentioned, you're losing about 10% of the taxes levied. So I'd say you'd be right around the norm for those that can give raises, but not all municipalities can give raises. So it just varies all over the state.
You danced around that nicely.
Yeah.
Well, I feel that the percentages for the individual town, I don't think you can take a look at broad spectrum. I think you have to look at how your budget is. Some of us get too excited. We want to give everybody Cadillacs. You know? So with that in mind, since it's individual to the town, I worry about the compounding. It looks all nice to give 1, 2, or 3 or whatever, but that compounds over the years. I tend to agree with Mike, and 2% would be probably where I would feel it would be okay. I think compounding scares me to go further and further each year. So I would feel okay with 2%. Stop buying a couple of lawnmowers or something.
Chris, you had any thoughts?
I think I'm right there with you guys. Look at the best interest long term. Wish we could give.
You have to be the adults of the town.
What are our rates on our bonds? Is there any room there or any advantage for restructuring those or refinancing those for those for short term?
We refunded our wastewater bond, gosh, I want to say 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and
Refunded?
refinanced it.
Okay.
We've looked at our water bond, doing something with that the last couple of years, and our GO bond will be paid off in January. And that's where we buy the police equipment from, which we'll bond again for that because they'll need new vehicles. And then, of course, we have our park, which it has 8 more years. Yeah.
What's the rate on that compared to today's rate?
All of those are right around, I want to say 3%, aren't they? We have good rates on all of our bonds. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right.
That's good rates. Okay.
Okay, well, I suppose we could advertise for 3 and then kind of shoot for 2. You're in consensus on that? We need a vote? Do we need, what do you need? Anything?
Yeah, we would need a vote, right? Well, we can advertise, right? So you can make a motion and we'll advertise at 3%. And we have until the salary ordinance is passed to approve the raises. So when we usually do that the first meeting in December or the last meeting in November, somewhere around then, is when you'll approve the salary ordinance for 2020.
Back, but we can't go.
Exactly. We have to advertise worst case scenario.
So would the motion be to accept this budget? 3%? Advertised at 3%?
then we can go backwards.
Anybody want to make that?
I'll make a motion to accept this budget on the 3%.
Do I have a second?
Second.
A second. Further discussion? Okay, my only other discussion is caveat that we seem to be in agreement that 2% is probably fiscally responsible. All those in favor of, by saying aye? Aye. Opposed? Advertise away. Thank you for all your work. Keep an eye on this. Feel free to keep a sharper eye anytime.
On behalf of the employees, thank you for keeping an open mind about the 3%. We do appreciate it.
10% increase in productivity.
Yes. I don't know how you, I mean, these guys are working like dogs for you already. I don't know how you're gonna get more for them.
Keep working.
Yes, sir.
Anything else on the budget?
Any questions from the reports I sent last week, or?
Having heard none, I'll move to adjourn this meeting.
Motion to adjourn the meeting?
Budget meeting, do I have a second?
Second.
Further discussion? All those in favor of adjourning the budget meeting signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, we are done with the budget meeting. Mark, we have a special council meeting,
Yes, sir. Advertised for 7:30, sir.
7:30.
Yes, sir.
Okay.